Blokes are absolutely incorrigible.
We tried on that.
You are unbelievably incorrigible. Yes. What's your next question?
All political leaders have ambition. Ambition to achieve. For their country, their party, and themselves.
So many of us arrive up here with ambitions. I'm young enough to defer them for a lengthy period of time.
They might rise all the way up to the very top. So whether that would be for me or not is something that history will determine.
Ambition to leave a mark in history.
It is only natural that if you set your heart on a particular career, that you set your heart on going to the top. I keep being told by the media that I should take a long-term visionary view. We think we're pretty good, and we are.
What effect does a leader's ambition have on the people? In this series, we will see how the Government of Australia became the machinery for one leader's ambition to change the nation's idea of itself and its place in the world.
A few moments ago, I telephoned Mr. Kevin Rudd, and I congratulated him and the Australian Labor Party on a very emphatic victory.
At the end of 2007, Australia rejected John Howard's coalition government. He lost almost as decisively as he had won in March 1996.
We bequeath to him a nation that is stronger and prouder. That is stronger and prouder and more prosperous than it was 11.5 years ago.
A new generation of Australians had only ever known John Howard as Prime Minister. Over almost 12 years, the Liberals and the government became synonymous with this man. For the Liberals, this is not new. Since Menzies founded the party in 1944, it has always depended on its leader for a vision and political direction.
The Liberal Party, in its structure under Robert Menzies, always has great currency on a very powerful leader. It's not an organisation in the same sense that the Labor Party is.
Malcolm Fraser turned the Liberal Party around to be an extension of Malcolm Fraser. A Liberal Party leader has far more capacity to change the Liberal Party, to change the party about him in his own likeness.
There's a party that has always placed a premium on the individual spirit. And you have to understand the culture of the Liberal Party to understand its responses and its reflexes.
How do they emerge, these leaders who will be so central to the party's identity? Some leaders create power. Some leaders seize power. And some leaders never give up until they've achieved power. It took the ambition and tenacity of John Howard to defy expectations, overcome defeat and ridicule, and change the face of Australia in his own image.
When I look back over John Howard's life, there's no doubt he had to overcome a number of obstacles to get where he got to. There were some physical disabilities, like his hearing, for example. There were issues around, I suppose, the fact that he hadn't come from the big end of town, so he didn't have an automatic entree into the top levels of society. He wasn't seen as a charismatic leader a la Hawke, so he had to overcome a number of barriers.
I think from the time I was probably 18 or 19, I saw people in the Liberal Party who, although some years older than I was, were going into it and involved in it. And I thought, well, you know, if she can do it, why couldn't I?
Howard entered Parliament in 1974. It was a turbulent time. The next year, the Liberals would engineer the dismissal of the Whitlam Labor government.
Gough Whitlam was the Labor hero. He was, for many, regarded as a hero by the press, by the media, and they found that hard to overcome. And we'd pulled him down. I think John Howard has publicly said that he's had latter-day doubts about whether that should have been done. He wasn't opposed to that decision then.
With ambition as his mentor, Howard was careful not to fall out with his Prime Minister. He was quickly rewarded with a junior ministry.
Howard made a big success of his ministerial opportunity. He's always been somebody who follows rules. I don't think Malcolm Fraser saw anything more than a very competent junior minister at the time.
And by 1977, he'd only been in the Parliament then 3 years, he was Treasurer at a young age. And again, John Howard had reason to be grateful to Malcolm Fraser.
I just happened to be in the right time at the right place. I hope one of the elements in it was ability, but I wouldn't claim that it was all due to that. I think there is an element of, fortuitous circumstances in it as well.
I thought he was able, industrious. He could master a brief, and going through the ministers that might do the job, I thought he'd do it as well as any and better than most.
Howard had some different ideas on financial policy. For 30 years, Western governments had intervened strongly in the economy in pursuit of stability and fairness. But the conventional wisdom was changing. Economic rationalism was on the rise, and a belief that government should leave the economy to market forces.
Malcolm Fraser would be the first to admit that he didn't really believe in the deregulation of the financial system. He had more interventionist views on the financial system than I did.
He was never going to pursue radical economic rationalist reform because he didn't believe in it. But I mean, John Howard did, and a newer generation of Liberals did believe in market outcomes, the liberal market model, privatisation and deregulation, getting rid of tariff protection.
The two didn't always see eye to eye on policy, and I think their personal relationship, certainly the relationship with the officers, was proper, but it was not a warm relationship.
John Howard, as Treasurer, was bullied by Fraser. John Howard achieved very little as Treasurer. He wanted to introduce some kind of broad-based tax. Fraser stopped it. He wanted more reform of industrial relations. Fraser stopped it.
Morning. How are you?
We're well.
That's good.
Is there any good news in this budget?
I'll wait and see.
By the early 1980s, the electorate was turning against Fraser. Australia was in recession, stricken by drought, with soaring unemployment and interest rates. John Howard was learning that from now on, the fate of political leaders would depend on their ability to manage the economy. But it was too late for his own survival in this government.
The Treasurer of this country no longer has any credibility in this campaign.
According to the opinion polls, you may not have been doing such a splendid job.
Well, the opinion polls that I worry about are those on election day.
Australia's economy is in a mess. My government will work hand in hand with private enterprise to get the economy going again.
Bob Hawke was offering Australians an end to the adversarial politics and bitter social divisions of the previous era.
Every now and again you get a political leader who really sort of runs off love of the electorate, something like charisma, and that, you could argue, was the sort of Hawke phenomenon. Normally it's not like that, and normally that doesn't work. It did with Hawke, quite clearly.
I want to say that I, from this moment, resign from the leadership of the Liberal Party. I will not contest the leadership of the Liberal Party.
Fraser's departure in 1983 left a vacuum. The Liberals were again bereft of direction and philosophy.
And the Liberals are never good at opposition because they don't have a reason for being other than to govern. They don't assume once they're in power that they're going to be out of power anytime soon. Now, this makes it very difficult for them to function in opposition because they're always searching for the Messiah to bring them back to power.
Malcolm Fraser had not arranged a natural successor. Former Foreign Minister Andrew Peacock and ex-Treasurer Howard competed for the leadership.
I will be standing for the leadership of the party.
Well, I will be nominating for the leadership of the Liberal Party.
It was going to be a fierce struggle between two highly ambitious men.
There's be rivalry in political parties over the question of who constitutes the best option to win an election, who constitutes the best option to lead and define a party, who can announce the policies the best, who is likely to be the most successful leader.
The party decided that Andrew Peacock, a man of charisma from the Melbourne Liberal establishment, was the obvious choice. John Howard was his deputy.
There's no doubt he was on the right of Liberal politics, and Andrew Peacock's constituency was more naturally a wet or moderate sort of constituency. But a lot of these antipathies within the Liberal Party have essentially been the result of personal wrangling rather than deep ideological cleavages or chasms.
While the Liberal Party struggled in the wings to remake itself, Labor held centre stage. They were ushering in an era of dramatic economic reform, with confidence and momentum.
We will be dismantling a very large proportion of the exchange controls which are part and parcel of the present managed rate system.
We would phase out all our quantitative restrictions, including tariff quotas, licensing and embargoes.
The Labor Party really stole the Liberals' clothes from 1983 when Bob Hawke as Prime Minister and Paul Keating as Treasurer embarked on a deregulation program that was beyond what even the Liberals would have dared to think about. The Liberals found that very difficult to counter, and I'm not sure that anybody was listening to their policy pronouncements during the 1980s, because if they were, they would have heard two very discernible voices speaking.
Oh, well, John will be doing most of the talking. You'll have to take it. You'll have to take mine.
The personal rivalry between Peacock and Howard intensified. Each was determined to be leader. A united front was impossible.
I have been totally loyal to Mr Peacock from the time he became leader. I haven't plotted against him. I am not plotting against him. I am doing my job, I think, effectively, and I will match my loyalty with anybody in the party at the present time.
Howard's people decided that they wanted to get rid of Andrew and work to undermine him. And that led to, 13 years in the wilderness.
Peacock decided to sack Howard as his deputy leader. The plan backfired.
John Howard hadn't wanted to challenge, but Andrew in the party room had not got his way. And on principle, he quit. John Howard was leader. Extraordinary. He got thrown into the job as leader, and I think he was actually ready for it, but I'm not quite sure that the party was ready for it.
Howard struggled to unite a divided party. Even more difficult was his task of convincing Australia that the Liberals were a viable alternative government, and Hawke was about to call an early election.
That if the Prime Minister has an early election, he'll be the greatest political phony of the decade. John Howard talking about people being a phony. Honest John.
A surreal push for Prime Minister by the Queensland Premier split Howard's right-wing Liberal support. He was undeterred.
The tax reduction program I announced today represents a decisive change in the economic direction of Australia.
But an embarrassing double count in the Howard tax policy figures doomed the Liberal campaign.
I've seen some lemons in my time, but this one I think takes the prize.
For John Howard, it's still uphill all the way in the personal ratings, despite his designer glasses, trimmed eyebrows and brand new dental work. Today's poll shows Andrew Peacock romping in as the most favoured Liberal leader with 47%. An anonymous some other leader scores 24, which leaves John Howard with a mere 17%.
In the period in opposition, John Howard didn't have much luck at all. You would think that once a day he'd kick a black cat and smashed a mirror. And yet out he'd go each day and he'd go out to bat. It was actually impressive to watch. If I were he might have stayed in bed.
I've no doubt that if we are seen as having reasonable unity and cohesion, we'll murder the government at the next election. Murder them.
If you can't govern your party in opposition, then there's no way you can govern the country.
In politics, to succeed, you've got to have a combination of ability and also luck. I think I've had a reasonable measure of the former, on occasions not so much a good helping of the latter.
Peacock then seized back the leadership in a stunning party room coup.
Ladies and gentlemen, obviously by your attendance here, you're aware that there have been some changes in the upper echelons of the parties on our side of politics.
In the 1990 election, Peacock went extremely close, but didn't deliver the Liberals a win. They went down again to Hawke.
The overwhelming mood in the party room was, we've got to sort of move on. And of course that was very bad news for John Howard, because moving on meant he would not be the leader. And whatever ambitions he might have then had, they were pretty well expunged.
The Liberals were now desperate for a leader to restore to the party an identity and sense of purpose.
Ladies and gentlemen, the outcome is Dr. Hewson is the new leader of the Liberal Party.
The Liberal Party, which had had such a miserable time in the 80s, had elected this newfangled man, this super monetarist, this Johns Hopkins bright young thing. And he was probably the best thing that ever happened to the Labor Party in, for some time at least.
Liberals?
No, to the Labor Party.
His basic thinking was that he was going to write the plan for the future of Australia. He was going to write the book on it. Fight Back was the ultimate reform document in Australian politics.
I'm going to tell you what's in it. It meant free trade, it meant reduced tariffs, it meant continuing privatisation, it meant the deregulation of the labour market.
No Australian opposition leader has ever put such a comprehensive, detailed package together. It was a very large target, which made it easy to attack.
If ever there was a bundle of rubbish, it's this lot. Inconsistent, full of distortions, full of lies.
If you are so confident about your view of Fight Back, why won't you call an early election?
The answer is, mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
Though Keating was confident, Labor was now in its 10th year and badly behind in the polls. The Liberals now had both a leader and a clear policy. 1993 was their unlosable election. But the Labor campaign was devastating in its focus on a single issue.
Newspapers, books and magazines, up. Used cars, up. Tradesman service calls, up.
I often ask myself, if somebody else was the leader selling it, would we have won in? If John Howard sold Fight Back, would we have won in 93? I don't know. And, Keating obviously wore us down.
Hewson lost the 1993 election. Obviously, his leadership was doomed from that date. By this time, we'd had Peacock, Howard, Peacock, Hewson, then we're going to go back to Howard again.
A couple of people rang me and said, you've got to run. One of them was Peter Costello. And so I did, and I won. But I must admit, I remember going to bed on that Friday night, and as I was getting into my bed, I said to my wife, I'm not sure I really want to win this, because if I win, I'm not sure I've thought about what I'd do having won. And I think that sentiment said it all.
I pledge myself to do everything I can to restore hope and a bright future for Australia.
Downer's leadership was short and fatal.
Downer vows a fresh start. How are you going over there, Curly? Old darling?
You are one of the most unctuous, self-righteous people I have come across. Always preaching as though to say that people who don't agree with everything you say are somehow racist, bigoted and immoral.
This is a salmon that actually jumps on the hook for you. In fact, there's 3 or 4 of them. There's a whole little group of them there. Mr. Speaker.
Paul Keating was a political brawler, and it was very hard for a young leader to take him on. Downer wasn't working. It was clear his leadership wasn't going to last. John Howard, as ever, was keen to become leader of the Liberal Party. He never stopped running for leader, but good on him. Ambition's a wonderful thing in politics.
John Howard, in a way, snuck up on us. I mean, he'd been sitting there, you'd watch him in the Parliament, and he did seem a little shrewder than his colleagues, but he was considered pretty well dead and buried.
We were sort of thinking aloud about whether or not he could become leader again. And I told him he could never be the king again. He could never be the leader. He could never be Prime Minister. All he could be would be the kingmaker.
I was the deputy leader. I was actually senior to Howard in 1994. And he came and he sought my agreement to stand aside and to help him become leader, which I gave.
I think when it comes to tenacity, John Howard is almost in a class by himself. And there must have been times when he probably thought that no one except his family had any faith in him, and that probably would have been justified for him to have felt that way. The fact that there were so many naysayers is probably what motivated him to keep going.
He really sublimated everything to winning.
The party has, for the first time in 30 years, unanimously elected a leader. By its decision today, the Liberal Party has given new heart and hope to millions of Australians throughout this country who are aching for an alternative government.
Prime Minister Paul Keating announced the election date today, and he says it'll be about leadership and the opposition's lack of vision.
Here we go again.
Opposition leader John Howard signalled he'd be running on the It's Time theme.
13 years in government is a long time in anybody's language. This man has run out of steam. There was that feeling of great hunger for change. Not just a question of, oh, well, they've been a pretty good government and we quite like them, but it's probably time for a change. It was more visceral than that.
You asshole! Get a job!
I didn't say go get a job.
Huh?
I didn't say go get a job.
Imagine another 3 years of it.
Australia in 1996 was 5 years out of recession, but to most voters it still felt like a recession. Each time Paul Keating talked about Mabo, or he talked about the Republic, or he talked about our place in Asia, people thought that he'd forgotten their kitchen table concerns.
Those who could afford to have the broader view, if you like, of Australia, loved Keating for his vision. Those whose lives were more necessitous needed more persuading than we were able to deliver to them.
What he did was to position Keating in particular as a representative of the elites, wearing Italian suits, interested in opera, not being a sort of an ordinary Aussie bloke going to the sport, talking around the barbecue, wearing a tracksuit.
The electorate was thoroughly fed up with Paul Keating. Howard tried to keep a very small profile.
He's refusing to debate.
He's rolling himself into the smallest ball possible.
There are hundreds of thousands of Australians who have always voted for your party, and they are literally aching for the opportunity to vote against you at the next election.
The mood amongst Labor people is very pessimistic.
Labor's going to lose between 20 and 30 seats, and the coalition majority is going to be around the 40-seat mark.
I'm feeling quite sick, disgusted and in shock.
I think it'll take Australia back to the back 30, 40 years.
Absolutely delighted.
He's not a show pony.
I don't mind which street he's living in, but I'm very glad he's the Prime Minister.
My feelings were one of sort of pride in this man who had been through so many ups and downs and had been whacked from pillar to post. And then, after all of that, his country had said, John Howard, we'd like you to lead us.
We have been elected with a mandate. We have not been elected to be just a pale imitation of the government that we have replaced. Now, there were moments, of course, when you think, gee, this is a dizzy experience, but I never felt intimidated by it, and I never felt that we couldn't do the job. The adversity as well as the success had tempered me. It meant that I tackled the job with assurance, but also a sense of reality. Because I'd missed out before and because the public had rejected me before, they could easily reject me again.
Howard's years of struggle and the lessons he'd learned now paid off. His first move was to fortify his position by surrounding himself with people who could deliver what he wanted, both inside and outside the party.
Those wilderness years taught him a lot about politics and personalities and how you marshal your forces against other people. So I think he consolidated his power by bringing a group of like-minded people, I suppose, into the tent.
You got to bear in mind, in a cabinet, apart from me, I was there because I was elected as the deputy leader. Everybody else was appointed by the Prime Minister anyway. So if a Prime Minister can't get a majority in a group of 16 or 17 people, 15 or 16 of whom he's appointed, it'd be a pretty strange day.
Howard would prioritise economic policy as most crucial to staying in power.
He knew that economics and getting the economics right was central to that sort of thesis of building a stronger and prosperous Australia. He'd had the experience of being Treasurer in the previous government, so he had first-hand experience of what worked and didn't work.
This was soon apparent. As Treasurer in the Fraser government, Howard had left its budget in deficit. Howard and Costello now examined the finances left by Labor and immediately called a press conference.
Yesterday we were sworn into government. Today we release the real situation. The underlying deficit on the Treasury's measure has blown out from 6.7 billion to over 9 billion.
In 1983, the Howard deficit left to Hawke was close to $10 billion. Political cycles sometimes deliver surprise, but always opportunity.
Obviously, all of our program is going to have to be looked at in light of the facts that we now know and which were known to the government during the election campaign, but which were deliberately withheld from the Australian community.
Labor knew this and sought to hide it. But today's announcement exposes Labor's deceit during the federal election campaign.
Well, we quite literally had to in real terms, cut spending in just about every portfolio area. Now, the question arises within that process, do you display priorities. I guess you do.
One of the first things that John Howard did when he became Prime Minister was to sack a number of senior public servants. Now, Kevin Rudd hasn't done that. Hawke never did that. And obviously he believed that appointing the right people was very important, and he took great care to ensure that all significant appointments were made with his approval.
They didn't shoot 6 secretaries for the fun of it. They did it for a reason, and it wasn't for reasons of lack of professionalism. It was to signal to the public service that the public service needed to toe the line, and I was a collateral damage in that process. Now, that's life.
It was an atmosphere of mistrust. It was an atmosphere in which Maxwell Wilton, the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, imposed the government's views and wills. Senior public servants were considered by the government to be lemons, and only a few were good secretaries of departments. Names weren't mentioned, but clearly it affected people's confidence and ability to work.
They made massive cuts to the public service and then slowly started making reappointments. Most of the reappointments were minders, were people who were media managers or message managers in one way or another. The office of the Prime Minister became enormously powerful.
To succeed inside the Howard government, the Howard cabinet, it seems that you needed to pretty much agree with Howard. So over the 11 years of his Prime Ministership, people who didn't agree with him in the party or in the government tended to leave to go on to other things.
The cuts in funding were not just simple economic judgments. They were also about John Howard's prejudices as to who was deserving and who wasn't. Which are the groups that, if I offend them, it's not going to cost me much in terms of lost votes?
The cuts to ATSIC were political. The cuts to the ABC were political. They were saying, OK, it's a different game now. We're in power and this is how we're going to run things.
They really went about knocking over everything that had Keating's metaphorical name on it. But it never occurred to me how strong was the instinct for revenge.
The object was to balance the budget, and we did it. And we wouldn't have done it if we hadn't have taken the axe to the Keating government's programs.
Although a lot of the heavy lifting would have been done in that budget by Costello and his department, the political calculus would have come from John Howard, and Costello would have just organised the cuts of the bits that John Howard never really liked.
It was a very tough assignment because we had tried very hard to spread the pain around, and I think we succeeded.
Tonight I announce a program for families, for small business, for older Australians, and importantly, a plan to repair the nation's finances and secure our future.
Let's talk about promises if we can. Prime Minister, you promised in the election to maintain spending on labour market programs, yet you've slashed $1.8 billion. You promised to maintain spending to universities, to the ABC. There's many more promises that have been broken in last night's budget.
The core commitments of the government have been delivered. They have been delivered to families. They have been delivered to small business.
The core non-core promise proposition, I think, did feed public cynicism and was probably in later years used to batter him around the head.
Mid-term, the electorate sensed a loss of momentum in the new government. It seemed indecisive over major political issues, and new scandals broke out.
There were ministers resigning, there were improprieties in government, travel rorts. It wasn't a very settled ship. They looked like a bunch of amateurs.
In latest polls, the Prime Minister's personal approval rating slumped from 42% to 36%.
In the government, in its first term, it wasn't travelling well. And there was a bit of a belief, I think, even in the Prime Minister's mind, that the government was floating a bit, that It might even be a one-term government.
And that's when he decided, well, we've got to grab a big piece of unfinished business and get on with that. It was at that stage that he came back to taxation and the whole issue of the goods and services tax.
For John Howard, the GST was a cornerstone of fiscal policy. But it had destroyed the coalition at the 93 election. Howard ruled it out during his 96 campaign.
There's no way that GST will ever be part of our policy.
Never, ever.
Never, ever. It's dead. It was killed by the voters in the last election.
It was a surprise to the public in the sense that John Howard popped up on the TV one morning and said, you know, it's back on again.
I've read, and I don't know whether it's true, but I've read that Peter Costello, the Treasurer, wasn't even consulted.
Perhaps he felt that leaving his mark on the country with a GST was worth any risk.
My position now is that I am in favour of tax reform. I'll give you all of the details and you can make a judgment before I implement it. And if you don't like it, you'll vote against me. If you do like it, you'll vote for me. Now, that is the difference. It's open, it's transparent and it's honourable.
He lit the fuse on one of the more extraordinary episodes in Australian political history, namely a government went to an election saying vote for us and we'll put 10% tax on your Wheaties, you know. I mean, it was a pretty big thing.
GST, yes. Bring it in. I'd give it a go as long as it doesn't cost us any more in the long run.
When it was thrown out before, they promised they wouldn't do that. So now they're going back on their word.
How can you trust any politician?
Howard had won and lost the Liberal leadership during the wilderness years. He couldn't afford to lose this election. It would be the end for him. But though Labor won more than 50% of the popular vote, John Howard delivered the Liberals a narrow victory and his cherished GST.
He's won the great test of leadership. He's done a fantastic job. He's got it as long as he wants it.
The budget out of deficit. Out of the red and into the black in 3 years. We have achieved our goal. Our budget is now in surplus. We are back in the black. We are back on track.
With the budget in surplus, the government now sought to encourage consumer spending, investment and economic growth.
Consumer demand is picking up, the housing sector is strengthening and business investment remains very strong.
John Howard has been extraordinarily fortunate with the way his period in office has fitted into the business cycle. He came to power after the economy had just started going. The economy has been through its longest ever recorded period of gaps between recessions, if you like.
But it was the hard work that balanced the budget, weathered the Asian financial crisis and the US recession of 2000-2001 and kept the Australian economy growing.
The unemployment rate halved on his watch from 8% to 4%. Property prices doubled or trebled in some suburbs over the 11 years he was in power. These are all quite important numbers to explain the power of the John Howard era, the political pull he held over the nation during that period.
Polls showed the government was the trusted economic manager throughout its term in office. By now, the 1991 recession was a distant memory. Interest rates were low, and our lifestyle expectations grew and grew.
Now, the price of this wealth was obviously the debts that people took on to stay connected to the middle of the Australian economy.
And you're still in the electorate of Upper Swing, right?
Well, no, there's been a redistribution. We're not in Upper Swing. That's the old name. We're in Eden Refinance now.
Oh, so you're in debt?
Well, debt, it's in the state electorate as debt.
Oh, OK, so you're up past Hock.
Oh, we're well past Hock.
The problem was that too many people all decided I can afford to borrow more and I'll buy a better place. And the trouble is, when everyone decides that at the same time, you don't end up with a better place that costs you no more. What you end up with is very much higher house prices and very much higher debt.
After long years of bad luck, 2 election wins and a strong economy showed that the wheel had turned for him.
Howard himself said the times will suit me, and they did. He was lucky because the times shifted enough to make him seem the absolutely appropriate leader for a period.
Not only have we won for the third time, but this is the greatest two-party preferred swing to an incumbent government since 1966.
John Howard is very much a creature of the Liberal Party. He's been very keenly aware that the Liberal Party likes winners, that they have no time for a leader who's not going to deliver an election win. So he's always been prepared to be a little bit more of the pragmatist. And I think that's one of the distinctions between him and Peter Costello.
If you wanted to characterise the difference between Howard and me, he was a bit more on the expenditure side. I was a bit more on the lowering tax side.
Well, you always have to judge pragmatically what you think the public will accept. Policy is rarely pure or implemented purely. John Howard always used to say that, you know, he'd rather get 80% of something than 100% of nothing.
I took the view that it was the Treasurer's job to push and push and push for maximum expenditure restraint. It was my job to agree with him to the extent I needed to get the right economic outcome, but always to have an eye for the political impact of certain individual decisions.
John Howard taught Australians to measure their relationship with the government based on what they got back from the government, based on the handout. Budgets were used to make sure that voters were kept on side.
The budget I'm announcing tonight involves huge expenditures, nearly $200 billion.
The Coalition, if re-elected, will provide $19 million over 4 years.
I will be announcing the largest package of measures ever to assist families.
The tone and the overall direction was being set according to political parameters rather than economic parameters, to keep the electorate on side, to keep its constituencies on side that had won them office right back in the beginning in 1996.
The big operating idea for John Howard through 11 years of power was to promote this idea of individualism and of the family as the prime social safety net. He used the tax system to encourage private enterprise. He used the tax system to encourage people who took out private health insurance or sent their kids to private schools.
Because we want our children to get as best education as possible, and we weren't able to get that in the public system.
Well, we've been talking to Angela about taking up a second job to help pay for it all.
If you are well educated and in a good job, the standard of living clearly is going up.
Selling Telstra helped Howard and Costello to pay off the $96 billion government debt. But because their policies encouraged private delivery of services and education, our own expenses grew.
Whichever way you choose, private health cover is now 30% less.
Our mortgages and spending increased, and we were using credit as never before.
In effect, Costello privatised the government debt. He reduced it and reduced it and reduced it at the same time as household debt was increasing, increasing, increasing. Household debt is now over $1 trillion, which is the national output of the entire country for a year.
Nowadays, when kids move into their first houses, they're ones with 4 bedrooms, ensuite, swimming pool down the back, the 42-inch plasma screen, they're getting all this sort of stuff, and they're expecting to have it at the start. For us, it took 30 years to get, and I think my grandchildren's generation, I hate to think what they'll want.
Because it only costs a couple of extra thousand to go from 2-bedroom to 3, then from 3-bedroom to 4, and so on. Once you're out there, you're a long way from services. It's completely rational to say, well, we'll be at home. Why don't we just put $3,000 or $4,000 on the mortgage redraw and buy that big plasma TV?
But surpluses continued. Interest rates stayed low, and the Australian economy seemed indestructible. Could it last?
We started hearing talk around the international community that we were the miracle economy. But we were still due a recession by historical experience. By about 2002, 2003, the property market had peaked, and we were getting a sense there that maybe that bubble might deflate. Then, out of the blue, China decides to step up to the plate as a first world economy.
It's Australia's biggest single export contract, worth about $1 billion a year for 25 years.
This is the kind of outcome that will underpin the economic strength of this country, especially in the Asian Pacific region, for years into the future.
We are, as we are, the possessor or the locus of the massive resource base. Minerals, energy resources, in massive abundance, greatly needed by China for its own development. I think Mr. Howard was fortunate in that one could mark similarities between Mr. Howard and President Jiang Zemin. Mr. Howard was a thoughtful, pragmatic, but very controlling conservative. This resonated with the Chinese leadership, and they felt a comfort on the basis of that style, a shared style of leadership.
It kicked in income of the order of $8 to $10 billion a year to the national economy at a point where the economy might have gone south. We're actually at a position now where we're enjoying a second boom that carried all the way through to the 2007 election, even at the time when the world financial system looked like it was about to crash and the US was heading into yet another recession. Australia looked like it was in a position to dodge a second recession in a decade that the US experienced. Quite extraordinary.
Up until about 2000, 2001, everybody was calling the resource industry the old economy. They were saying that we'd missed the boat. It had to be on the .com boat. How wrong they were.
Back in the 1960s, Donald Horne said, you know, we are the lucky country, living on our luck. And he was talking about a mining boom. We're still living on our luck. We're still living on a mining boom. The other big driver of prosperity over the last 30 years has been household debt. At the end of the Howard era, I think there was a massive disconnect between the rhetoric that was coming from the government about economics and what people were feeling. Mortgage costs were rising, hospital costs, education costs, and yet they're being constantly told about prosperity. Prosperity, prosperity, prosperity.
Politicians on both sides stood back and said, this is great, this is what's supposed to happen under capitalism. And they weren't really looking down the track that says, maybe this will end in tears for a lot of people. We're starting to see the tears flowing now. You're talking about a weakness in the capitalist system.
In the government's final years, there were so many stresses and strains around rising cost of living and emerging debt pressures that people did feel that even though they were much better off than they had been, say, in 1996, they were really feeling the pressures of coping with everyday life.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's all right.
Mr. Howard's asking voters to go for growth, promising continued economic expansion and the sort of job creation that's driven unemployment to a 33-year low.
During the period that I was Treasurer, Australia experienced its longest period of uninterrupted economic growth. We took unemployment down to 30-year lows, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Australians got chances they would never have had before. To me, the tragedy of the Liberal government was, after creating such a prosperous Australia with the economy in such a strong position, we were voted out of office.
Good morning.
We've had a government that's been obsessed by cutting government debt and not about building infrastructure, not about saying, let's make sure we've got a very well-educated nation. I think that when people look back on the Howard government's economic term, they'll say, yes, we had 10 fat years, but when they went away, we didn't have a lot to show for it.
Under John Howard's economic management, Australia avidly pursued the wealth promised by the market economy. But as the 2007 election grew closer, the cycle of time and events that had favoured the government was turning, just as the economic cycle was about to turn.
The neoliberalism that Howard believed in was about using market solutions rather than government solutions to solve problems. Markets do some things, but they've also got limitations. And it seemed to me there was a potential for people to be swinging back to thinking maybe a little more government involvement might help solve some of our problems.
Well, I wanted a society that was built on individual effort. I did want a society where the small entrepreneur was given every encouragement. I wanted a society that looked after its less privileged and less advantaged people. I didn't want people knocked around. I mean, you can think that you maybe should have implemented something a bit differently or expressed it differently, but all the big decisions that I took and the strong stances I took that were consistent with that dual approach, I believed in at the time. And although obviously the electorate has passed some adverse judgments along the way, I don't know that I would do them any differently if I had the opportunity. And tax reduction program I announced today represents a decisive change in the economic direction of Australia.
We are back in the black. We are back on track.
The DVD of this program is available at Dimmicks and JB Hi-Fi.